The hiss of the pressure washer was a glorious sound, a symphony of suburban rebellion. It sliced through the grime clinging to the siding of my newly acquired, aggressively beige money pit. Except, it wasn't my pressure washer doing the slicing. Not yet. Mine was still nestled in its cardboard sarcophagus in the garage, a victim of circumstance and, let's be honest, a healthy dose of procrastination. No, this glorious hissing belonged to Big Tony, my contractor, a man whose biceps were the size of watermelons and whose vocabulary consisted primarily of grunts and surprisingly insightful one-liners. "More pressure, Tone!" I yelled over the din, feeling a perverse sense of satisfaction as a thick layer of mildew surrendered to the onslaught. Tony just grunted, adjusted a dial on the industrial-sized machine, and the hiss intensified into a furious roar. We were making progress. Real, tangible progress on the house that had, for the past 3 months, felt more like a hostile takeover than a home purchase. Then, the world went silent. Not dramatically silent, like in a movie where the music cuts out before the monster jump scare. No, this was the mundane silence of a machine suddenly starved of its lifeblood. The pressure washer sputtered, coughed, and died, leaving behind only the gentle drip of water from its nozzle. "Hey!" I yelled, striding over to Tony, who was scratching his head and looking perplexed at the now limp hose connected to nothing. "What happened?" Tony shrugged, his massive shoulders rippling. "No water, boss. Gauge dropped to 0. "No water?" I repeated, feeling a familiar knot of frustration tighten in my gut. This couldn't be happening. Not now. We were finally on a roll. "Yeah, no juice," Tony confirmed, kicking a tire on his trailer with a resounding thud. "Thought you had the hydrant sorted?" Ah, the hydrant. The innocent-looking red sentinel that sat just a hair's breadth outside my property line. The hydrant that was now, thanks to a certain neighborhood busybody, about as accessible as Fort Knox. "I did have it sorted," I muttered, pulling out my phone. "Permits are in order, city's been notified. What could possibly have gone wrong?" As if summoned by my question, a figure emerged from the pristine landscaping of the house next door. Tall, impeccably dressed in what I could only describe as country club casual, and radiating an aura of self-importance that could curdle milk. It was her. Patricia, but everyone in the neighborhood knew her by her preferred title. Karen, President for Life of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. She strolled over to the now silent pressure washer, a small, self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. In her hand, she held a pair of ridiculously oversized gardening shears, which, upon closer inspection, appeared to have been used on something far more substantial than petunias, namely, a section of what used to be an unoffending privet hedge. "Having some difficulties, are we, Mr. Henderson?" she purred, her voice a weaponized blend of sweetness and condescension. "Yeah, Patricia," I said, trying to keep the edge out of my voice. "Seems the water's cut off. Any idea why?" She gestured with the shears towards the wrought iron gate that now stood, gleaming black and utterly unnecessary, directly in front of the fire hydrant. It was flanked by newly planted, aggressively thorny rose bushes, as if daring anyone to even think about approaching the vital piece of infrastructure. "Oh, that?" she said, her eyes wide with faux innocence. Yes, the board felt it was detracting from the neighborhood's curb appeal. Such an industrial-looking thing right there. We had it screened and gated. Much more aesthetically pleasing, don't you think? My jaw dropped. You blocked the fire hydrant?" "Oh, heavens, no," she exclaimed, clutching her chest dramatically. "Of course not. The fire department has a key. It's all perfectly legal and above board." She tapped her perfectly manicured fingernail against the cold metal of the gate. "Strictly for aesthetic purposes, you understand." I did not understand. What I understood was that this woman, in her infinite wisdom and boundless capacity for petty tyranny, had just single-handedly shut down my renovation project over aesthetics. A fire hydrant. Something designed for emergencies. Something absolutely crucial, blocked by a decorative gate. My contractor, Big Tony, who had been observing this exchange with a growing sense of bewilderment, finally lumbered forward. "Ma'am," he said, his voice surprisingly polite for a man who could probably bench press a small car. "We kinda need that water to, work." Karen gave him a dismissive wave. "I'm sure you'll manage. Perhaps you should have planned ahead." And that was it. The smugness, the blatant disregard for common sense, the sheer audacity of blocking a fire hydrant for the sake of curb appeal. Something snapped. The slow burn of HOA frustration I'd been experiencing for the past 3 months erupted into a full-blown inferno of righteous indignation. I looked at the gate. I looked at the hydrant, tantalizingly visible through the wrought iron bars. I looked at Big Tony, whose patience was visibly thinning. And then, a truly terrible, wonderfully ridiculous idea began to form in my mind. I pulled out my phone again, my fingers flying across the screen. "Tony," I said, a slow grin spreading across my face. "Forget the pressure washer for a minute. I've got a better idea." 2 minutes later, I hung up the phone, the grin now bordering on manic. Karen was still standing there, preening like a particularly smug pigeon. "Well, Mr. Henderson," she said, crossing her arms, "I trust you'll find a suitable solution to your little water problem." "Oh, I will, Patricia," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "I absolutely will." And then we waited. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken animosity. Karen tapped her foot impatiently. Big Tony just stared at me, a question mark etched onto his brow. Then we heard it. A low rumble in the distance, growing steadily louder. It was the sound of a diesel engine, a deep, guttural growl that seemed to shake the very foundations of Willow Creek. Around the bend in the perfectly paved cul-de-sac, it appeared. Not a plumber's van, not a city water truck. No, what lumbered into view was a behemoth of steel and rubber. A gleaming silver cylinder mounted on a multi-axle trailer, pulled by a roaring semi-truck. It was a water tanker. A commercial-grade, thousands of gallons water tanker, the kind you see hauling potable water to remote construction sites or filling up swimming pools the size of small lakes. It was magnificent. The sheer scale of it was enough to make Karen's jaw drop, her smug expression dissolving into a look of utter disbelief. Big Tony let out a low whistle, a hint of a smile finally breaking through his stoic facade. The driver, a burly guy with a handlebar mustache and a trucker hat, expertly maneuvered the massive vehicle, its air brakes hissing like an angry dragon, and parked it directly in front of my house, its vast bulk completely eclipsing Karen's precious little gate. "All right, boss," the driver yelled out the window, a mischievous glint in his eye. "Where do you want this bad boy?" I pointed towards my driveway. "Just park it right there, if you would." He nodded, put the truck in reverse, and with a series of loud beeps, backed the tanker into my driveway, its sheer size making my house look like a particularly elaborate doghouse. Karen found her voice, a strangled squawk of outrage. What is the meaning of this?" I turned to her, the picture of innocent bewilderment. "Meaning? Oh, Patricia, I simply needed water for my project, and since the neighborhood aesthetics have made the readily available source somewhat inaccessible, I had to improvise." I gestured towards the towering silver cylinder. "Problem solved, wouldn't you say?" Her face was a study in apoplectic fury. Her carefully applied makeup seemed to crack under the strain of her outrage. You can't just park that monstrosity there. It's blocking the street. It's an eyesore." "Well, Patricia," I said, leaning against the side of the tanker with a casual air I most certainly did not feel. "At least it's not detracting from the curb appeal of the fire hydrant. Wouldn't you agree?" Big Tony chuckled, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the asphalt. Even the trucker driver was struggling to suppress a grin. The first call to the authorities came within 5 minutes. I wasn't surprised. Karen was not one to let an injustice, especially one perpetrated against her aesthetic sensibilities, go unanswered. 2 police cruisers pulled up, their lights flashing a silent, accusatory blue and red against the perfectly manicured lawns. 2 officers emerged, looking slightly bewildered. The first was a seasoned veteran, Officer Miller, his face etched with the weariness of countless suburban disputes. The second was a fresh-faced rookie, Officer Davis, whose eyes widened in undisguised amazement at the sight of the water tanker. Karen, practically vibrating with indignation, rushed towards them, pointing a trembling finger at the offending vehicle. "Officer, this man! He's obstructing the street! He's brought this industrial thing into our peaceful neighborhood!" Officer Miller listened patiently, his gaze drifting from Karen's frantic gesticulations to the enormous water tanker, and then to me, leaning casually against it like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Mr. Henderson?" Officer Miller asked, his voice calm and measured. "Can you explain what's going on here?" "Certainly, officer," I said, pushing myself off the tanker. "I'm in the process of renovating my home. We needed a significant amount of water for some pressure washing and other tasks. Unfortunately, the community fire hydrant, which would have been the most convenient source, has been temporarily rendered inaccessible." I gestured towards the gated hedge. Officer Davis's eyebrows shot up. Officer Miller just sighed, a barely perceptible movement. "Mrs. Davison here," I continued, smoothly ignoring Karen's sputtering protests, felt that the fire hydrant was aesthetically displeasing and had it concealed. As a result, I had to secure an alternative water source. I patted the side of the tanker. "Hence, Brenda here." Officer Davis snorted, quickly it with a cough. Officer Miller just rubbed his temples. "Mrs. Davison," Officer Miller said, turning to Karen, "did you in fact have a gate and landscaping installed in front of the fire hydrant?" Karen launched into a tirade about bylaws, curb appeal, and the importance of maintaining property values. Officer Miller listened, his expression remaining impassive. After a few minutes, he held up a hand. "Mrs. Davison," he said, his voice firm but polite. "While the HOA may have its regulations regarding landscaping, obstructing access to a fire hydrant can have serious safety implications. Do you have documentation from the fire department authorizing this obstruction?" Karen's bluster deflated slightly. She mumbled something about the fire department having a key. "Having a key is not the same as authorizing obstruction," Officer Miller pointed out gently. He turned back to me. "Mr. Henderson, is the tanker parked entirely on your property?" I nodded. "Yes, sir, just inside the property line." Officer Miller surveyed the situation, his gaze lingering on the towering tanker and the ludicrously small gate. "Well," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice, "it appears Mr. Henderson has found a rather unorthodox but technically legal solution to his water problem. Mrs. Davison, I would strongly advise you to consult with the fire department regarding the accessibility of the hydrant. Now, if you'll excuse me, Officer Davis and I have other calls to attend to." With that, the 2 officers got back in their cruiser, Officer Davis shooting one last incredulous glance at the water tanker before they drove away. Karen stood there, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. She glared at me, then at the tanker, then back at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "You haven't heard the last of this, Mr. Henderson," she finally sputtered, before stomping back towards her pristine property. I watched her go, a sense of weary triumph washing over me. It was a small victory, won with an absurdly large water tanker, but a victory nonetheless. Big Tony clapped me on the shoulder, a rare smile spreading across his face. "Brenda, huh? Suits her?" "Yeah," I said, grinning. "Brenda's got our back." The rest of the day was a testament to the power of several thousand gallons of water, and a contractor who was now thoroughly enjoying the spectacle. We powered through the pressure washing, Brenda's ample reserves providing a relentless stream of cleaning power. The neighbors, drawn by the commotion and the sheer absurdity of the situation, started to emerge from their houses, offering words of encouragement and the occasional cold beverage. It turned out, Karen's reign of terror hadn't made her many friends. "She made me take down my Halloween decorations in July," one elderly woman confided, shaking her head. "Tried to fine me for having dandelions in my lawn," another neighbor chimed in. The stories poured forth, each one a testament to Karen's relentless pursuit of suburban perfection at the expense of common sense and neighborly goodwill. It seemed my water tanker wasn't just providing water, it was providing a focal point for collective frustration. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the now gleaming beige siding of my house, Brenda's job was done. The pressure washer was clean, the grime was gone, and the house finally looked like it had a fighting chance. The trucker driver, his mustache twitching with amusement, hooked Brenda back up to his rig. "Pleasure doing business with you, boss," he said, winking. "Give my regards to Karen." As Brenda rumbled back down the street, leaving a trail of bewildered onlookers in her wake, I felt a sense of profound satisfaction. It had been a ridiculous, over-the-top solution, but it had worked, and it had sent a very clear message. The next morning, I woke up to a surprisingly quiet street. Karen's usual early morning power walk was nowhere in sight. Her perfectly manicured lawn looked, well, perfectly manicured, but somehow less menacing. Later that day, a different kind of truck pulled up to my property. This one was from a local fence company. Two burly guys, who looked like they could handle even the most stubborn HOA president, got out, carrying tools and sections of wrought iron fencing. My heart sank. Had Karen doubled down? Was she planning to build an even more impenetrable fortress around the fire hydrant? But they didn't head towards the hydrant. Instead, they started working on Karen's property line, carefully removing the newly installed gate and the aggressively thorny rose bushes. Curiosity overriding my caution, I walked over to them. "Excuse me?" I said. "What are you doing?" One of the workers, a grizzled man with a toothpick hanging from his lip, just shrugged. "Got a call to take this stuff out." "Who called you?" I asked. He jerked his thumb towards Karen's house. "Lady who lives here." I couldn't believe it. Had Brenda's dramatic entrance actually had an effect? Had the threat of further, even more absurd retaliations finally gotten through to her? Over the next few weeks, life in Willow Creek started to subtly shift. The oppressive atmosphere of constant HOA scrutiny seemed to lift. Neighbors started talking to each other more, sharing stories of Karen's past transgressions and laughing about the legendary water tanker incident. A few weeks later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. The first line read, "At a recent emergency meeting." I braced myself for a barrage of fines and legal threats, but as I read on, my eyebrows slowly crept upwards. Patricia Davison had been impeached. The new HOA president was Mrs. Henderson from down the street, a sweet, elderly woman who had once been fined for leaving her Christmas lights up until January. The new HOA held its first meeting a few weeks later. It was a far cry from the tense, rule-obsessed gatherings of the past. The atmosphere was relaxed, almost jovial. The main topic of discussion was the upcoming neighborhood barbecue. "We need to make sure we have enough hot dogs," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice warm and friendly. "And maybe we should have a water balloon fight," someone suggested, and the room erupted in laughter. I even saw Karen, looking surprisingly subdued, watering her now unfenced front garden. We made eye contact, and for a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of something that might have been respect? Or maybe just resignation. My own renovation continued, albeit at a slightly less frantic pace. The dumpster eventually got emptied, the paint finally went up, a tasteful light gray, which, thankfully, no one objected to, and the dilapidated mailbox was replaced with a standard non-HOA-approved model. One sunny afternoon, as I was sitting on my newly painted porch, enjoying a cold beer, Mrs. Henderson strolled over, a plate of homemade cookies in her hand. "Alex, dear," she said, offering me the cookies. "Thank you for everything." I smiled. "It was nothing, Mrs. Henderson. Just a little bit of petty rage and a whole lot of water." We both chuckled, looking out at the peaceful, subtly changed street. The wrought iron gate was gone. The fire hydrant stood proud and unobstructed. And in the heart of Willow Creek, a sense of community, long dormant, had finally begun to bloom. All thanks to an HOA Karen, a shut gate, and one very large water tanker named Brenda. The initial dumpster incident, for instance, wasn't just a polite request from Karen. Oh no, it was a full-blown confrontation, complete with her brandishing a laminated copy of the HOA bylaws like a holy text. "Mr. Henderson," she'd declared, her voice echoing across my weedy, unkempt lawn. Another violation, I'm sure, but one I hadn't gotten around to yet. Article 3, Section B, Paragraph 7, clearly states that all refuse containers must be kept out of public view except on designated collection days. Your eyesore is a flagrant violation. I'd been wrestling with a particularly stubborn piece of linoleum flooring at the time, and the sight of her in her pristine white capris and perfectly coiffed hair lecturing me about aesthetics while my hands were covered in adhesive was almost too much to bear. "Patricia," I'd said, wiping a bead of sweat from my brow with the back of my equally adhesive-covered hand. "The dumpster arrived an hour ago. Collection day is tomorrow. I'm literally in the process of filling it with the remnants of the previous owner's questionable taste in wallpaper. Give me a break." "Bylaws are bylaws, Mr. Henderson," she'd sniffed, her nose wrinkling as if she'd caught a whiff of something truly offensive, probably my general existence. "Ignorance of the law is no excuse. I'll give you 24 hours to rectify this situation, or I'll be forced to issue a formal violation notice, which, as you know, carries a significant fine." A significant fine. Just what every new homeowner sinking their life savings into a dilapidated property needs. I'd grumbled under my breath as she'd marched back to her own meticulously maintained fortress, leaving me to contemplate the injustice of it all. I'd briefly considered draping a strategically placed tarp over the dumpster, but the thought of Karen peering under it with her judgmental gaze was even more unsettling. The landscaping dispute was another comedic gem. I'd envisioned a splash of color amidst the suburban beige, a vibrant maple tree in my front yard. I'd spent a considerable amount of time researching native species, ensuring it wouldn't be too disruptive to the local ecosystem, unlike, say, blocking a fire hydrant with a thorny hedge. The day I planted it, I felt a surge of accomplishment. It was a small thing, but it felt like a step towards making this place my own. That feeling lasted approximately 12 hours. The next morning, I found a brightly colored violation notice tucked into my door. Unapproved tree species, violation of HOA Bylaw 4, subsection C, Appendix G. Appendix G, as it turned out, was a ridiculously detailed list of approved flora, none of which included anything remotely resembling the majestic red maple I had so carefully chosen. My attempt to reason with Karen about the environmental benefits of native trees and the sheer beauty of a vibrant autumn foliage display was met with a blank stare and a robotic recitation of the bylaw. Aesthetic harmony, Mr. Henderson. It's all about aesthetic harmony. The paint color saga was equally infuriating. I'd opted for a subtle, sophisticated shade of light gray. It was modern without being jarring, a neutral backdrop that would allow my eventual landscaping to truly shine. I'd even gotten a sample and painted a small patch on the side of the house, just to be sure. The very next day, another violation notice appeared. Unapproved exterior color deviation from the approved palette, outlined in Exhibit D. Exhibit D, I discovered, was a collection of the most bland, uninspired shades of beige and off-white imaginable, each one seemingly designed to suck the very soul out of the neighborhood. Karen, of course, had her own opinion. "Colonial ivory, Mr. Henderson," she'd declared with the unwavering conviction of a zealot. "It's the only truly acceptable color for our community. It evokes a sense of timeless elegance." Timeless elegance, apparently, meant looking like every other house on the block had been dipped in a giant vat of slightly dirty cream. I'd briefly considered painting the house a vibrant, unapologetic purple just to see her head explode, but the thought of the inevitable legal battle, and more fines, had dissuaded me. Even the mailbox replacement had turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. My original mailbox was rusted, dented, and barely hanging on its post. I'd found a sturdy, attractive, perfectly standard mailbox at the local hardware store and installed it with a sense of minor accomplishment. The next violation notice? You guessed it. Non-conforming mailbox, violation of Article 6, Section A, Subsection 2, which mandates the use of the Heritage Brass's model available exclusively through the Willow Creek HOA approved vendor. Pricing details available upon request. The Heritage Brass model, I discovered, was an obscenely expensive, ostentatious monstrosity that looked like it belonged in front of a Victorian funeral parlor. And of course, it cost 3 times what my perfectly functional mailbox had. Each of these small battles chipped away at my sanity, fueling the simmering resentment that would eventually boil over when I saw that ridiculous gate blocking the fire hydrant. It wasn't just about the water anymore. It was about the principle. It was about standing up to petty tyranny and reclaiming a tiny sliver of control in my own life. The arrival of Brenda the water tanker wasn't just a spectacle for me and Karen. It sent shockwaves through the entire neighborhood, creating a ripple effect of reactions, from stunned silence to outright cheers. Initially, there was a stunned silence. People peered out from behind their curtains, their morning routines disrupted by the sight of the enormous silver cylinder parked in my driveway. The sheer audacity of it was almost mesmerizing. Then came the whispers. Neighbors started venturing out onto their porches, exchanging bewildered glances and hushed theories. Was it a delivery gone wrong? Had Alex finally lost his mind? As the police arrived and the drama with Karen unfolded, the whispers turned into more animated conversations. People started gathering at the edges of their lawns, observing the scene with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Old Mr. Henderson, no relation, who lived across the street and whose prize-winning roses had once fallen victim to one of Karen's overly zealous pruning sprees, gave me a subtle thumbs-up from his porch swing. Mrs. Gable, whose son had been reprimanded for bouncing a basketball in his own driveway after 7 p.m., offered me a sympathetic smile. Once the police left, and Big Tony and I started the pressure washing, the atmosphere shifted again. The sheer volume of water being unleashed, the thoroughness with which we were cleaning the grime off my house, and, inadvertently, a fair amount of the street, became a form of entertainment. Children on bikes stopped to watch, their eyes wide with fascination. Teenagers pulled out their phones to record the spectacle. Even a few of the more staunchly pro-HOA residents couldn't resist peeking out from their windows. The offers of support started subtly at first. A neighbor brought over a cooler of bottled water. The irony was not lost on me. Another offered Big Tony a sandwich. Then came the more open expressions of solidarity. "You go, Alex!" someone yelled from across the street. "About time someone stood up to her!" Another voice chimed in. Mrs. Peterson, the elderly woman who had the Halloween decoration incident, even brought me a slice of her famous apple pie. "That tanker," she'd cackled, a mischievous glint in her eye, "is the most beautiful thing I've seen in this neighborhood in years." The interactions with Big Tony throughout this period were also a source of great humor. He was a man of few words, but his facial expressions spoke volumes. His initial skepticism about Brenda's arrival had quickly morphed into a quiet appreciation for the sheer absurdity of the situation. At one point, as we were wrestling with a particularly stubborn patch of mildew, he'd paused, looked at the towering tanker, and then back at the minuscule gate in front of the hydrant. He'd just shaken his head and let out a low chuckle. "Never seen anything like it, boss," he'd said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. "Never thought I would." Even the trucker driver, whose name was Earl, got in on the act. As he was preparing to leave, he'd leaned out his window and said, with a wink, "Tell that gate-loving lady I deliver." The day after Brenda's visit, the neighborhood buzzed with the aftermath. The water tanker had become a legend, a symbol of rebellion against the petty tyranny of the HOA. People stopped me on the street to congratulate me, to share their own frustrating HOA stories, and to ask for details about Brenda's impressive capabilities. It was clear that Karen's actions had backfired spectacularly. Her attempt to assert her authority had not only failed, but had also inadvertently united the neighborhood against her. The removal of the gate was just the beginning of the changes in Willow Creek. The emergency HOA meeting that followed Brenda's visit was, by all accounts, a tumultuous affair. Accounts from various neighbors painted a picture of heated arguments, impassioned speeches, and a palpable sense of long, simmering resentment finally boiling over. Apparently, I wasn't the only one who had been on the receiving end of Karen's overly zealous enforcement of the bylaws. Stories of arbitrary fines, unreasonable demands, and outright bullying poured forth. The Halloween decorations, the basketball bouncing, the unapproved petunias, it all came tumbling out. The vote to impeach Karen was reportedly swift and decisive. Mrs. Henderson, a kind and well-respected resident who had always maintained a quiet dignity in the face of Karen's pronouncements, was nominated and elected as the new president by an overwhelming majority. The difference was immediately noticeable. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over Willow Creek for so long began to dissipate. The constant stream of violation notices ceased. Neighbors started to relax, to take a little more pride in their individuality, even if it meant a slightly less uniform shade of beige on their mailbox. The new HOA meetings were a breath of fresh air. They were held in a neighbor's garage, with folding chairs and lukewarm coffee. The discussions focused on actual community issues, organizing a neighborhood watch, planning the annual barbecue, and finding a solution to the recurring issue of overly enthusiastic squirrels in the community garden. The proposed water balloon fight at the barbecue became a major point of discussion, with Mrs. Henderson ultimately giving it her enthusiastic approval. "As long as no one aims for the freshly baked pies," she'd declared with a twinkle in her eye. My own interactions with Karen became minimal. She kept a low profile, tending to her garden with a noticeable lack of her previous imperiousness. There were no more accusatory glares or condescending remarks. It was as if the water tanker incident had somehow deflated her, leaving behind a quieter, slightly less formidable version of her former self. One afternoon, I saw her struggling to carry a large bag of mulch. Against my better judgment and the memory of countless petty annoyances, I walked over to offer my help. She looked surprised, a flicker of her old suspicion returning to her eyes, but then she just nodded curtly. We carried the bag together in silence. It wasn't a moment of profound reconciliation, but it felt like a truce, a small acknowledgement that perhaps, even in the most tightly regulated suburban enclaves, a little bit of common courtesy could still prevail. The final touch to my renovated home was the landscaping. I planted a vibrant mix of native flowers and shrubs, a riot of color that would have undoubtedly sent Karen into a bylaw reciting frenzy just months before. But now, the neighborhood seemed to embrace the diversity. Other houses started to show flashes of individuality, a splash of brightly colored paint here, a quirky garden gnome there. Willow Creek was slowly transforming from a sterile, uniform landscape into a place with a little bit of personality, a little bit of charm, and a whole lot more neighborly spirit. And it had all started with an HOA Karen, a shut gate, and a very large water tanker named Brenda. It was a reminder that sometimes the most absurd solutions are the most effective, and that even in the most regulated environments, a little bit of rebellion and a whole lot of water can go a long way. Throughout the tumultuous events, Alex's internal monologue has been a key element of the humor. Let's delve deeper into his thoughts and reactions, providing more opportunities for his sarcastic wit to shine. As Karen delivered her initial pronouncements about the dumpster, Alex's mind was racing. Oh, here we go. The welcoming committee. I was expecting a casserole, maybe a friendly wave. Instead, I get the suburban Gestapo and a lecture on refuse containment. Remind me again why I thought moving to the suburbs was a good idea? Oh, right, the slightly less astronomical mortgage. During the endless parade of violation notices, his internal commentary became increasingly elaborate. Another one? Seriously? What's next? Am I breathing too loudly? Is my shadow not in compliance with the neighborhood's shadow placement ordinance? I swear, if they fine me for the angle of my window blinds, I'm moving into a yurt and becoming a nomadic goat herder. At least goats don't have HOAs. When the gate went up in front of the fire hydrant, Alex's internal fury was palpable. That's it. That's the line. You mess with my questionable taste in paint colors, fine. You critique my perfectly adequate mailbox, I'll grit my teeth and order your overpriced brass monstrosity, but you block a freaking fire hydrant? Lady, you've just declared war, and I'm about to bring out the heavy artillery. Or, in this case, the extremely large aquatic transport vehicle. Even during the seemingly mundane interactions with Big Tony, Alex's inner thoughts were a source of amusement. Look at him, all stoic and contractory. I bet he's seen some things in his day. Dodgy plumbing, collapsing walls, probably even a squirrel infestation or two, but I guarantee he's never been part of a suburban water tanker standoff. This is going straight into his most memorable jobs highlight reel, right after that time he had to remove a bathtub full of snakes. The arrival of the police also sparked a flurry of internal observations. Ah, the cavalry has arrived. Or, you know, two slightly bored-looking officers who probably had their hopes set on a quiet afternoon of donut consumption. Officer Miller looks like he's one misplaced garden gnome away from early retirement. Officer Davis still has that fresh-out-of-the-academy gleam in his eye. He probably thinks this is exciting. Bless his naive heart. As the neighbors started to emerge, Alex found a surprising sense of camaraderie. Well, look at that. Turns out I'm not the only one who's been living under the iron fist of Karen the Great. Misery loves company, I suppose. Or maybe it's just that everyone secretly hates overly zealous rule enforcement. I should have brought a megaphone. We could have a neighborhood-wide therapy session fueled by lukewarm lemonade and shared HOA horror stories. Even after Karen's impeachment, Alex couldn't help but offer a mental commentary on her subdued demeanor. Look at her, watering her petunias like a normal human being. No power strut, no condescending glances. Has Brenda truly broken her? Or is this just a temporary lull before the inevitable resurgence of suburban tyranny? I'm keeping my eye on you, Patricia. Never underestimate the resilience of a truly determined HOA president, or former president, as the case may be. These internal monologues not only enhance the humor, but also provide insight into Alex's character, making him a relatable and engaging protagonist. Beyond the immediate aftermath, the water tanker incident had some unexpected and lasting effects on the neighborhood. For one, it became a legendary tale, recounted at every subsequent neighborhood gathering. The Great Water Tanker incident of Willow Creek was a reminder that sometimes a little bit of creative and slightly absurd defiance is exactly what's needed to shake things up. Brenda herself became a sort of folk hero. Kids would point out similar water tankers on the road and exclaim, "Look, Mom, it's Brenda's cousin." Alex even considered getting a small, toy water tanker to display on his mantelpiece as a memento. The incident also fostered a greater sense of community spirit. Neighbors who had previously only exchanged polite nods started to connect, sharing their own stories and offering support. The new HOA, under Mrs. Henderson's genial leadership, focused on fostering a more inclusive and less rule-obsessed environment. Bylaws were reviewed and revised, with a focus on common sense and neighborly consideration. The annual neighborhood barbecue that year was the most well-attended in recent memory. The water balloon fight was a resounding success, with even a few of the former staunch HOA members joining in the fun. Karen, while present, remained somewhat on the periphery, but even she managed a small smile when a stray water balloon landed harmlessly at her feet. Alex's house, now freshly painted and landscaped, finally felt like home. The small battles with the HOA had been frustrating, but they had ultimately led to a positive change in the neighborhood. He had gone from being an outsider, struggling against the rigid rules, to a catalyst for change, a reluctant hero armed with sarcasm and a very large water tanker. And every time he looked at the unobstructed fire hydrant, standing sentinel on the edge of his property, he couldn't help but smile. It was a small, red reminder of the day that Brenda the water tanker rolled into Willow Creek, and a little bit of sanity was restored to the suburbs.